Now it's a pleasure to introduce our colleagues from Victoria University, Carl and Sam, but also other colleagues from Victoria University attending the meeting, Sam McIntosh, Alice Redding, and the rest of VU colleagues. They are experts in the field of Australian football, as Carl worked in Adelaide, and Sam in the Bulldogs, the Western Bulldogs. I confused the name, sorry. They are experts in that field, but also they have cooperated in other sports such as basketball and soccer. So we are open and ready to know more about you and how do you investigate and apply performance analysis and sports science in a specific context and professional context. Now is your time, Carl and Sam. And thanks again for joining us.
No worries at all, Miguel. Lovely to be here, and thanks to the guys up at JCU. That was a really nice overview of some of the fascinating work you're doing. So hopefully we can complement some of that from a slightly different perspective in a different sport. So I might see. It looks like I can share my screen relatively easy versus the others. Let me just get that up and going. And so we might just do, as a quick overview, I think Sam will run through a bit of an overview to our kind of broader line of research in sports performance analysis at Victoria University. And then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about some of the translation of that research in practice task design in Australian football. And then Sam McIntosh, who's one of our colleagues embedded at the Western Bulldogs, he'll talk a little bit more about his role and how he uses data to assist with player recruitment and player evaluation within the AFL. So with that, we'll see how we go. I'm running it off my computer, so we're going to try to juggle Sam talking while I manipulate the slides. So bear with us if we get a little bit wrong along the way. But might throw it over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Carl. Buenos días. Mucho gusto conocerlos a todos y muchas gracias por hablando inglés hoy. Australia está muy lejos de Europa, así que esa es nuestra excusa para hablar solo inglés.
Gracias, Sam.
Ya he visitado España 3 veces este año, Madrid, Sevilla y Cádiz, así que está claro que queremos hablar y trabajar más con todos ustedes en el futuro. Entonces, ahora cambiar el idioma para mis amigos australianos.
Perfecto.
So, I will talk very quickly for 3 or 4 minutes about what we do here. Carl, you can probably change slides to start. With our work in sport at Victoria University, we look at 4 main areas. Our performance analysis work runs across lots of different areas, but in particular, the first 2 areas you see in the middle of this slide, in the analysis and the technology area and our skill area. We have around about 95 students and staff that work in our research area. You can see the picture at the top of our screen is where we do most of our work, which is 5 floors of our staff. The picture down the bottom is another area that is being built next to the university at the moment and due to complete shortly. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some of the partners that we work with. The work that we do in sport is almost all of that is working with the industry, because we do some work in the laboratories, but probably 90% of our work is done actually working with the partners. So this is the really big focus of what we do. Carl, you can change. Thank you. So 2 of the big things that we like to work on in talking about our understanding of performance as a model. Carl will talk to you specifically about what he does there, but also developing new metrics or new numbers that fit into these models. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. And then the other part of our work in performance analysis is on decision making. So particularly working with athletes about how they make decisions and why they make decisions, how to make their lives easier as well in collecting less data, not getting in their way. For coaching, we've heard about training design already. We certainly do work on training design as well as more, let's say, traditional work on technique analysis for coaching. And then we also do work in working with the decisions of organizations. And Sam, the other Sam, Sam McIntosh, will talk about that in a moment, how we can actually inform things like which players to select in the draft or to contract. Carl, you can change again. Thank you. So I thought all I would do here very quickly is just talk about some examples of our work that I know. And the reason I do this is just to maybe give you ideas about where we could work together, or maybe ideas that you think you could apply to different sports. I have chosen mainly Australian football examples, but as Carl said at the start, we do a lot in real football, soccer, some people in the world call it, but we all call it real football, but also in basketball as well. These are two big sports for us. So you can see here is an example of a paper that we did on improving the models of understanding performance in Australian football, and then a very recent paper down the bottom around developing a new metric, a space-time metric using tracking data. You can change, Carl. Some example of our decision-making work on athlete, maybe one of my favorite papers I have been involved with down the bottom on developing a model to look at how players pass the ball relative to how much risk versus how much reward they would have in a specific pass. And then another example in the top about how we can make training more specific in terms of how long training goes for, not what we do in training, but how long it goes for based on the pieces of information we're collecting. Carl, you can change. Lots of examples. I may not go through all of them here, but there's some examples in the training design area, which we have talked about already. Some very traditional work around the technique analysis, but also things that are very, very different for coaching now. So things like, how do we know the words that coaches use to communicate with athletes are the right ones? And do coaches know the types of words they use and how often they use it? How much of their language is positive and negative? So really looking at this from all sorts of data, from event data and tracking data to also verbal data and qualitative data as well. And the last slide I think I have for you is the next one, which is talking about the organizations and how we can make organizations make better decisions. And I wrote a commentary a couple of years ago for the Journal of Sports Sciences, which talked about this very topic, about how this area of performance analysis can, in fact, improve itself, because it is a job that is not maybe held in regard as well as it could be compared to coaching or physiotherapy in these areas. But the good news is, I think there are very obvious things we can do to improve that. So these are some of the things that we are working on. I think that is all of my slides now, and I can hand over to Carl to continue on.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I'm not going to be anywhere near as fancy as Sam's introduction was before, so bear with me as I only know English. So I'll slow down as I go. But as I briefly touched on at the start, and as Sam touched on before, I'm going to focus a little bit more intently on how some of our research leads into practice task design, not just at a kind of micro level of the actual activities themselves, but at a broader sporting organizational perspective. And I put up two papers that I'll kind of allude to throughout this presentation, which we've written with some of our really wonderful colleagues at Sheffield Hallam University and the sort. So I'll touch a little bit on how we integrate some theoretical constructs, specifically ecological dynamics, into to performance preparation in Australian football. So I guess to start, almost linking back, Miguel, to your earlier introduction with regards to how we better bridge science in the field, I guess bringing practitioners along with us, so not almost imposing ideas onto them that they need to do, but working with them to find really effective ways of bringing life to our research. And one of the big pushes that this line of research does is tries to bring in a more integrated way the experiential knowledge, that real rich knowledge of coaches and athletes and applied scientists and performance analysts who have been working years in the industry with, I guess, the more scientific empirical knowledge, the theoretical constructs, rather than them kind of pitted against each other. We're really, in this particular line of research, trying to bring them together, integrate them, and kind of then inhabit that middle zone where we're preserving some of that real key practitioner knowledge, and then bringing in and complementing that with some of our fairly sound empirical research. Now, what the goal of that is then, rather than it being the performance analyst or the sports scientist coming in and kind of dictating how things are to be done, we're trying to blend that into much more of a meshed transdisciplinary group of practitioners. Now, the goal of that is that what we're trying to push towards is greater player environment interactions. So we're really changing our unit of analysis with this particular line of research. We're not focusing on the athletes themselves or just the environments. We're focusing on how the athletes and the environment, I guess, mutually interact to lead to certain behaviours that we see emerge in training and competition. That has really rich implications for practitioners and perhaps how they start to take up with their role. So I guess they evolve from these traditional, in a way, solution providers, the kind of holders of how things should be done, towards the designers of these real rich practice environments that, I guess, in a similar way to perhaps you may see an architect where they help design a particular building, and then the people that inhabit that building are the ones who work out where the furniture is to go, where it's more functional for them, given that they're the ones that are going to be primarily inhabiting that space. So if that's a bit of our basis for this line of research, I want to give you a bit of an overview as to how we brought this to life. As you said, Miguel, prior to joining Victoria University in 2020, in my current role, I was the manager of coaching science and innovations at the Port Adelaide Football Club, an AFL team. And one of my first mandates was how to integrate a real ecologically dynamic framework, which preserved the knowledge, that rich experiential knowledge of the coaches. And this was from we published this particular framework in one of those earlier papers that I referenced. We developed a framework which we referred to as Heads Up Footy. And the overarching goal of this particular framework was that we wanted to support the players to become more adaptable in their fit between what they can do and what the environment affords for them. So to go about, I guess, bringing that particular goal to life, we had to set up a few key pillars to this integrated framework. And the first of which was that we really need to push towards becoming representative learning environment designers. And the key with that was that we really wanted to expose players to various opportunities that a game affords, not immunize them from it, not close them away from the rich diversity of things that an AFL game particularly can afford players. To help us do that, I guess the pedagogical approach that we leaned on was a non-linear one, where we sought to embed a constraints-led approach, where I guess we started to view it not as a set of discrete skills that players were acquiring, but an ongoing, I guess, evolving, adaptable set of movement solutions to various problems that the game posed. Within this, we had to appreciate that there are many different ways to achieve success in the game. And this was quite profound because it really challenged the notion of game models in high performance sport, which is something that Sam and myself and some other colleagues have published on in rugby union, actually pushing away from a rigid model of performance to perhaps more principled behaviour, where players have a little bit more exploratory freedoms to test things out and figure out other ways to solve various solutions or various problems in games to lead to various solutions. We really wanted to encourage exploratory behaviour in this particular framework. We wanted to expose players to opportunities where they could become a little bit more creative rather than conforming to prior established socio-cultural conventions of how perhaps Australian football should be played. And that led us to really push into wanting to explore ways of encouraging player ownership. So through notions of co-design, where we would invite players to provide us with really valuable feedback with regards to the session designs themselves, or the game principles, or how we were delivering feedback to them, where they started to take a lot more ownership over their program. So it was less hierarchical and a lot more equal in how we went about designing our particular environment. Now, for the next couple of slides, I just really want to touch on a couple of elements of this heads up footy to give you some, I guess, practical insights to how this particular framework, this performance preparation framework, was brought to life in professional Australian football. So I guess a little bit less of the harder science that we've come through, and a little bit more of the practical translation of some of these ideas. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview to a particular practice task that we designed a few years ago. And this particular learning activity, this practice task, had a focus on offensive transition in the game, which is a concept I'm sure in football or basketball you're quite familiar. But that's transitioning from defence to attack as fast as we possibly can. So our kind of overarching intention then, what we wanted to do to design this really rich representative practice environment, was we needed to figure out what kind of affordances or what kind of opportunities we wanted to design into the practice task to really encourage players to explore various ways to organise from defence into attack. So within this particular practice task, we added in some of these affordances or these opportunities, things like manipulating various numbers at certain parts of the ground. So in a certain area of the ground, maybe there was a +1 or a -1, a various number in inferiority or superiority. We added in temporal constraints, so times to score as the activity was unfolding, to give players, almost incentivize the players moving faster. And we played on larger fields to encourage players to actually explore those various opportunities. And to help us design those affordances or those opportunities into the activity, we use these various constraints, like I touched on before: number inferiorities, temporal constraints, and various ways in which that we afforded that space on the field. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is, if you've never seen it before, this is an Australian football field. And this is this particular offensive transition activity that we designed. It was a 15v15 activity. And as you can see in those two blue circles, there's number inequalities. And those number inequalities are designed to, I guess, favour certain teams, but not eradicate various opportunities that the game afforded. And as you can see, we added in a temporal constraint, and we made the field, or we played on a full-size field to enable opportunities for players to explore the affordances that the game unfolded. And I thought what might help is actually show you what this looked like in practice. So this is the actual activity that you saw up on screen. And really interestingly, before I show you this short clip, I want to emphasize that the ball movement strategy that you see emerge is just that, something that emerged under the dynamic context that unfolded. This was nothing orchestrated from us from a coaching perspective. There was no mandated, this is how we have to move the ball. What emerged was as a result of these interacting constraints, which we designed into the particular practice task. So you can see the black team win the ball here. They transition it back, which is a constraint that we'd added in, if you remember. You can see the players spreading to all the space on the far side of the field. They decide not to take up that particular affordance, transition the ball through the middle of the field, and they managed to do this, I think, at about 19 seconds was the speed that they transitioned the ball inside 50, which is, again, them exploiting that particular temporal constraint that we added in. So, again, it's a really wonderful example of some very careful constraint manipulations can lead to these really rich behavioural tendencies in practice environments. Now, that was the design of it. I want to touch really briefly on how we then monitored the representativeness of that. So it's great to have these wonderful training activities, but if they don't really afford similar opportunities to what a game does, there's perhaps no real point to go at them with any vigor. So we monitored representativeness in two particular ways. On the left, you can see we found through some in-house research this to be a really effective way for coaches to understand the representativeness of the particular training activity. So in this particular radar plot, this spider plot, the black lines, if you can see, are what an AFL game affords. Now, what we're referring to here is what it affords in terms of the constraints that shape disposal, shape kicking. And so you can see on the outside, we started to get our analysts coding things along the lines of uncontested possessions, contested possessions, whether in that contest we were superiorly numbered or inferiorly numbered, how long we had the ball for, so whether it was 3 seconds, 2 to 3 seconds, 1 to 2 seconds, 0 to 1 seconds, whether that was stationary, whether we were moving. So all of these, I guess, really important descriptors, which helped us get a bit of an indication as to were the ball movement strategies similar and were they being shaped by similar constraints to what we would expect to see in a game. And the red line in this particular instance, you can see is the training activity. So straight away, without actually delving further into the makeup of these numbers, you can see that the training activity and the game afforded a very similar pattern in terms of the constraints that were shaping disposals in that particular training activity. So that's a bit of a sign to us, I guess, objectively, that the design is fairly representative. Maybe a few more uncontested possessions in that activity that we would usually expect the players to have in a game. It's probably because the numbers were less than what we would expect or than what an AFL game would be played. What I actually found really effective over the years, though, was something really simple, which led me to write a paper on this with Sam and some colleagues a few years later, of opening up player feedback to the actual design of the activities. So at the end of every training session, players got sent on their phones a questionnaire that they filled in with regards to how they felt the training activity design was, how good it was relative to what a game afforded. And you can see the information that we got from the players was often really, really rich. Things along the lines of what they were seeing, what they were feeling and hearing during the game, which gave us another layer to how we monitor the representativeness of the games. So they provided some verbal descriptions of what they were feeling, but then obviously they anchored some of that as well to a 0 to 5 scale with regards to, was the activity challenging, was it game-like, and did they feel it improved them as a Port Adelaide footballer? So nothing too extreme in terms of how we were monitoring the representativeness, but a very effective way which our coaches and us in the innovations department found it would be quite effective to convey that information, actualize that information to help us redesign and design parts of our practice environment. Really quickly, I'll run you through a second example of what designing practice activities using a constraints-led approach was beneficial for us at Port. In this particular example, I want to show you how we're able to manipulate constraints to help players actively self-regulate in competition. So in this particular learning activity, it was a match simulation game, and all the players were really told was the goal was to win the activity. But towards the end of the match simulation, the scores would be artificially manipulated to place one team just in front and one team just below to see what kind of ball movement strategies would emerge. And then they were given time to kind of postulate strategies, talk amongst themselves about what they might want to do. If we're in front, are we going to preserve the lead, or are we going to try to extend the lead? If we're behind, are we going to hang on to possession of the ball, or are we going to actually try to score as fast as we possibly can? Again, the key here is that nothing that emerged wasn't imposed. There was nothing imposed from us as a coaching and innovations group on the players. All these rich behavioural emergences just occurred based on that really simple constraint manipulation. And what we started to see was some really interesting observations. So a team in front at the point of constraint manipulation, we started to see these various strategies emerge of resting with the ball. And again, going back to these radar plots, you can see the black line is an AFL game. The red line is the training simulation after that constraint was manipulated. And you can see the team that were in front tried to search for more affordances, more opportunities of uncontested possession, hanging onto the ball, or as you can see up on the screen, resting with the ball. On the flip side, somewhat unexpectedly, the team behind, we started to see this caution with the wind, biting off a lot riskier decisions, a lot riskier kicks, a lot riskier passes to try to obviously win the game. What was really impressive, actually, over a prolonged period of this kind of training intervention, we started to see the team that was behind start to manipulate and alter, regulate how they were going about playing this particular match simulation. They started to actually hang on to the ball a lot more. They almost adopted a bit of a strategy to the team that was in front. Why was that the case? Because it was a bit of an indication that they wanted to kind of hang on to the ball and then strike when the opportunity emerged. But again, the bigger case here is what we were trying to demonstrate in this particular practice environment was that very, very simple, very concise constraints that we manipulate can lead to quite drastic behavioural changes at both an individual player and at a team level. So that's me. That's a bit of an overview to some of our work and application of that work in practice task design. And I'll throw over to you, Sam, again. Bear with us as we try to navigate through me manipulating the presentation and Sam talking.
Too easy. Thanks, Carl, and thanks for everyone for jumping on. As Sam and Carl have just gone through some space in Australian football, I'm just going to touch on player evaluation and recruitment in Australian football. So I did my PhD in this area with Victoria University and finished up about 3 years ago. And from there, I've sort of transitioned into working with the university as a postgrad researcher. But I'm also embedded with one of the football clubs that Vic Uni has a relationship with, and actually work in their list management and recruitment department there, where I work as an analyst. I'm going to take you through some of the research that we've done in this space, some of the research that we're currently undertaking in this space, and then also probably touch on some areas that I'd love to get to at some point in the future. If you want to flick to the next slide, please, Carl. Before, I guess, I touch on some of the research, I just want to outline a bit of the landscape of list and recruiting, more for those not with a familiarity to Australian football. So firstly, just some of the things that confine the things that we can do with a football club. Firstly, we have a salary cap. So we only have a certain amount of money each calendar year that we can actually spend on players. We have fixed list sizes, so we can only have between 42 and 44 players any given year. So we have both a fixed amount of money and a fixed amount of players that we have to spend. Player contracts. So it's unlike some of the American or North American sports, we can't trade players who are currently under contract without their consent. That has to be an agreement between the player and the club. We also have a national draft each year, which is just an equalization measure, same as sort of the NBA and the NFL, in the sense where if you come last in 1 year, you then get the first pick in next year's draft. And this tries to equalize the competition in the sense that there is players out there and no clubs get specific access to certain players. There are a few uniquenesses to that, but I'm not going to go into the depth of that today. Essentially, if you come last, you get the first pick of the underage talent coming through, and that goes through 4 or 5 times across the draft. And the other thing that I've just put resources there, just each club, whilst there is a cap on what clubs can actually spend on staff within the football department, some clubs do have a different lots of resources depending on what they choose to spend on, say, player development. Some like to spend more on coaching, some spend more on recruitment. Most of the research that goes into this space is still basically around assessing or forecasting performance. One of the things about Australian football is the sport is incredibly complex and dynamic. Carl showed you a picture of the ground and the field out there before. There's 22 players, 18 from each team on the field at any given time. The field is enormous, so there's barely any stoppages in play, which means the dynamics of actually being able to create objective measures of performance is really quite difficult. But a lot of the research still going in is actually trying to get a good performance measure that you and the club can trust to then implement it at a club level. And once we have this measure of performance, we can then go and ask some more specific questions around valuing trades and team performance and comprehending other characteristics about the draft. Can you go to the next one, please, Carl? I also just quickly wanted to touch on some of the barriers to performance analysis in Australian football, which might be a little bit different to what some of you are familiar with. So we don't have access to players' salaries over here. That's not a huge issue, but just when it comes towards valuing player performance, it's a little hard to assess how clubs value different players. We actually don't have access to location data on opposition players. We only get location data on our own team. Fortunately, Vic Uni has some researchers who actually work at the statistics provider who does get access to that and are doing some pretty cool research in that space. But in Clubland, we don't have access to that. And as general researchers, we don't have access to that. Given I work in this recruiting space and I deal with different competitions, we do have differing levels of data at different leagues. So trying to make some performance analysis translatable between leagues can sometimes be a bit tricky if we have different levels of data. And some of our physical testing databases are actually quite poorly maintained from a historical point of view. So a lot of time and effort goes into actually getting this data into shape before we can even do any analysis with it. And then there's a level of confidence behind that as well before we can actually apply any of it. Can you go on? So as I mentioned, one of the main areas still in research is purely just trying to assess football performance down to an objective measure that we can then go on and do some objective analysis on. So as I pointed out there, and one thing I've probably learned by being implemented within the club is actually creating a measure which coaches and managers are happy to actually rely on and trust is really quite difficult. There is quite a lot of objective measures out there, some that are quite good, and as an analyst, I'm happy to say that I'm confident in them. But to actually get that across the board to coaches and to managers and have them trust that is another thing. So there's still a lot of work that goes into actually creating just objective measures of performance. And without this location data, that's just a level that we don't have to add to this. Some research that I've done with Sam Robertson lately is looking at comparing performances between leagues. So the ability to actually translate measures, like existing measures, between leagues to see how translatable they are. A lot of the players that we look to draft play in multiple leagues, and trying to get, I guess, some congruency on what is a good level of performance. It can be quite difficult when players are playing at lower tier leagues. And the other thing about assessing performance is actually assessing the assessor. So we're not just assessing players, but as an organization, we want to actually know how our coaches view performance, how our scouts view performance. And some research that we did at the back half of my PhD was to actually look at some subjective ratings of performance and see if we can just use traditional performance indicators to essentially predict what our coaches and scouts are thinking. And we actually got really close. We could predict within, like out of a 0 to 10 rating, for example, over 80% of the time we were able to predict within 1 point of what we thought our scouts and coaches would think. And this is sort of twofold. There's two things that we can then go and do with this. The first thing being it allows us to actually use what we think our scouts or our coaches are thinking and produce this on the other 800 players in the league. But it also allows us to sort of assess what biases the coaches may have towards specific players, or if there's specific players that just happen to beat the model. Can you go to the next one, please, Carl? Outside of assessing performances, then forecasting performance. So this is just using some traditional longitudinal models around actually predicting performance. This is obviously very reliant on firstly having that measure of performance, which I was talking about on the previous slide. And there's two levels to this. It's actually forecasting forward players who are currently in the league, if we have that objective measure of performance, but also trying to look at the expected performance we might see of potential draftees in lower levels and how they might actually perform within the AFL. Can you jump to the next one, please, Carl? One sort of area that I'm really interested in looking in now, and I've done a little bit of this in the earlier stages of my PhD, is given that we're confined by a salary cap and we're confined by team lists, trying to actually work out what the optimal distribution of talent within a team is. Do we want to have a lot of really high-end talent and maybe sacrifice at the tail end of our team, or do we want to have a really evenly distributed team in terms of talent? And then how do we actually spend that money within the salary cap to acquire that talent? The other thing, which I haven't done any research on just yet, but I'm keen to really look into, is how specific is player performance to the team structure or the team's dynamic? So can we just trade in a player, and are they going to have that exact same impact that they were having for their previous team in our team? Or is the impact that they're going to have very specific to the dynamic of our team and the structure in which we play, and what changes there will be with that? And what are some ways that we can actually simulate this prior to actually making the trade for a player? One of the things that we've just got a PhD student just starting on right now is looking at the draft depth. And this is something that I do more from an applied perspective, but haven't really done any research on just yet, is trying to look at the depth of talent each year. The AFL has a specific pick value metric, which I've sort of outlined on the screen there, and clubs sometimes use this as a valuing system for how to trade picks. The problem is it's a little bit outdated, and I think there are better ways to actually value the picks, and we want to use this for how we can actually equitably make trades with picks. So if you just click through twice, I think. So that red line that I've sort of squiggled on there is more where I think it's at from an applied point of view. And as I said, we've got a PhD starting in this area to look at this to try and determine whether we can more accurately look at trades. And one thing I'd love to get to in the future, I'm not sure how realistic it really is, but look to see if we can actually determine whether this changes year to year, given the performance data we've got, and see if this can help inform decisions around trading picks and trading players, both the coming year and 1 year into the future, so we can try to go into the draft with the picks that we want to have. And just the last slide, and this is something that I probably work on most in my day-to-day job, is actually trying to culminate basically everything I've just spoken about into having one big universal system where we can create a measure that includes valuing both players, draft picks in this current year, but also future draft picks, and put that all into one valuation system so we can, I guess, make objective assessments on decisions we have to make around trading, whether that be trading picks for picks, trading picks for players, and even trading future picks. Yeah, and that's basically where I'm at with our research, and I guess the research in this space that Victoria University is doing.
Okay, thanks, Carl, and both Sams. Nice to see you again, Sam McIntosh. I met you in Croatia. I remember that. It's a pleasure to meet you again. Online, not face-to-face, but it's great. Sam Robertson, thank you so much for your Spanish. It's very good. You need more bocata de calamares with me in Madrid for improving your Spanish. I think so. And my English, yeah, I need to improve my English for sure. But great time in Madrid with Sam. So thank you so much for your presentations. Great to listen to you, and quite interesting. I think that we can complement everything that you do with the performance analysis approaches with the Spanish institutions that we go on with similar research in the same areas, not in the same sport, but you are also experts in basketball and soccer. And I think that we can improve this cooperation between institutions, Spanish and Australian ones. By the way, Carl, I love your radar charts. I'm a radar chart lover, so I like it, the approach that you did for AFL training tasks. So great to see that.